Well, it's the middle of November now, so if you're headed out California way and you haven't made it through the Sierra Nevadas yet, I hope you have some fat friends with you. Before 1840-ish, if you wanted to get from the United States out west, your only real option was to buy a $500 boat ticket and take the 7-month, 15,000-mile trip around Cape Horn in South America. While cruises today are rather luxurious, back in the 1840s when they spelled Christmas like this, not so much. You could cut the time down by sailing to Panama, trekking through the rainforest, and catching another boat. And assuming you didn't get eaten by a jaguar or catch diarrhea and die, you'd save a whole $50. But in 1840, 13 people made the trip along what would soon be known as the Oregon Trail. And this became by far the cheapest route, costing between $150 and $200 per person, covering 2,000 miles. While the Oregon Trail does technically refer to this specific route from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon, it's also the collective name given to the Oregon Trail, California Trail, Bozeman Trail, Mormon Trail, and a few stagecoach and Pony Express routes. Since most of these trails go along the same route before splitting off, for our purposes we're going to refer to all of them as the Oregon Trail. Quick side note, if you wanted to go out west, you first had to travel through the Midwest, which is the exact same reason why this place is called the Middle East. By 1849, 18,847 people had crossed the Oregon Trail. How do we know the exact number? Because a number of forts were established along the way which kept track of the travelers and protected them from, well, there's no easy way to say this, the Native Americans, whose land they were technically trespassing through, so, you know. The forts also provided good old capitalists with place to set up shops to sell supplies, snake oils, and trail guides. This becomes important later. There were also a number of people known as Wagon Masters who made a living taking people back and forth along the trail. But in 1849, use of the trail exploded. Why? Well, you're smart, you probably know the answer already. It's gold. In January 1848, gold was discovered in Sutter's Mill, California. And since they didn't have the internet or ravens yet, it took almost a year for everyone else to find out. The sudden influx of migrants became known as the 49ers, which is where the name of the football team comes from. There were hundreds of ships left abandoned in San Francisco Harbor because people only intended on making a one-way trip to strike it rich. Over the next decade, the amount of people who used the Oregon Trail skyrocketed to a total of 296,300. This is what it looks like when 300,000 people, their wagons, and their oxen all go through the exact same place. There are several spots along the trail that still look like this over 150 years later, where the soft limestone was slowly carved down by hundreds of thousands of travelers all staying in the same ruts. Even if there appears to be a much easier path right over there. Seriously, I didn't go anywhere else to get this shot. This is only a few feet away. I don't get it. But these aren't the only remnants left by the travelers. On several spots along the Oregon Trail, people felt compelled to carve their name into the rock as a way to say, so-and-so was here. Old habits die hard, I guess. This is one such spot known as Register Cliff, where people carve their names, where they're from, and what year it... See, this is why we can't have nice things, because of people like this, 150 years later making it look like they made the trip too. Wait, what? Why is the 4 backwards? I mean, I guess that makes sense since they spell Christmas like this, but the 4 is the correct way around right here. At least be consistently wrong. This is another register site known as Independence Rock. Named that way because if you didn't make it there by July 4th, you probably weren't going to make it over the Sierra Nevadas in time. Which is exactly what happened to the Donner Party. They made it to Independence Rock 2 weeks too late on July 17, 1846. Now you may not think that 2 weeks is that big of a deal. Sometimes winter arrives late, sometimes it arrives early, but the Starks are always right in the end. This was complicated by the fact that George Donner purchased one of the aforementioned trail guides. Are you traveling out west? Want to avoid all of those pesky Indians and Mexican tolls? Would you like to shave 400 miles and 2 weeks off of the trip? Of course you would! Then you need The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, the 1848 Pioneer's Guide to the Westward Traveler by Lansford W. Hastings. Take the road less traveled. Call 1-800-500. You heard that correctly, the Hastings cutoff claimed to shave 400 miles off of the trip. Wyoming is 360 miles long end to end, so unless the cutoff looked something like this, it obviously didn't. In fact, it adds 150 miles. Combined with the fact that they were already 2 weeks behind schedule, well, they made it to here by the beginning of November, when they broke an axle and that very night were buried under snowdrifts 60 feet high. A normal wagon train could travel 10 to 15 miles a day. They were only 2 or 3 days from the end of the trail. On November 20th, 1846, Patrick Breen starts a diary which becomes the primary source for everything that happens next. It snows just about every day for the entire month. By Thanksgiving, they've completely run out of food. And on Christmas Eve, they draw straws. A man named Patrick Dolan loses, but being good Christians, nobody could bring themselves to actually do it, so they left him out to die from exposure instead, which actually takes longer than you might think. The human body is incredibly resilient, so it doesn't just happen overnight. On Christmas Day, Patrick Breen wrote, "Offered our prayers to God this cherrymas morning. The prospect is appalling, but hope in God, amen." Mr. Dolan dies that night, and the next day, they enjoy a nice Christmas feast. Because that's what Jesus would want, crying and unable to look at each other the entire time. Now you might be asking yourself why they didn't just eat people who had died already, and the answer is pretty simple, because they had already buried them, and being good Christians, they didn't want to dig up someone they already had a funeral for. Yet, they do that later. The bodies were cut up and labeled so that nobody accidentally ate their own family members. Because, you know, you have to keep some sort of morals, right? They aren't rescued until March 1847, 6 months later. Of the 89 people in the Donner Party, 41 of them died, 21 of them from cannibalism, including George Donner, which makes sense, I guess. Geez, did it get gloomy in here or what? In 1858, gold was discovered in Pikes Peak, Colorado. There. That's happy, right? Everyone loves gold. This is where the Denver Nuggets gets their name. We seem to have a thing for naming sports teams after something that happened 150 years ago. All of these gold rushes made the Oregon and various other trails much more popular, at least until the 1860s when 2 major events happened. The first was the Civil War, which, as you might expect, put somewhat of a damper on people traveling. But the second was the railroad, which followed the same basic path as the Oregon and California trails. And while it took almost a decade for it to be complete, it was heavily settled and a town sprung up every 50 miles. The days of being a pioneer headed off into the unknown beyond were numbered. When it was completed, it brought the trip from several months down to only a few days, which basically ended the Oregon Trail 20 years after it started. These 2 simultaneous events just kind of made the Oregon Trail fall out of fashion. So those who could afford the few days railroad trip out west obviously did. Why would you still take the over 1,000-mile trip on foot? Because you're a Mormon. The tale of the Mormons is interesting and probably deserves a video to itself. But the main point here is that they were fleeing religious persecution and settled in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1847, which at the time was outside of the United States. All through the 1850s and 60s, the Mormons made the trip from Nebraska to Utah and soon became the primary users of the trail, especially for the poor European converts who couldn't afford the trip by rail. They were often so poor that they couldn't afford wagons and oxen and used hand carts instead. When we look back at history, we often have trouble with timescales. When talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, some people will take events that took place over centuries and compress them down as if they all happened within the same decade. With American history, we have the opposite problem. The actual profession of cowboy only lasted 14 years. Although that doesn't stop people from dressing up like one like it's Halloween year-round. The Oregon Trail, for the most part, only lasted about 20 years. If we want to be really fickle about it, it was only in popular use for about 10. While that might seem like a long time, it's actually shorter than the war in Afghanistan, so put some perspective on it. And the next time someone offers to sell you a guide that will cut 400 miles off of a trip by taking a shortcut, hopefully now you'll know better. I just want to quickly thank everyone who took the survey I put up last week. Your responses are great, and I plan on putting up an analysis on Reddit in a few days. But in the meantime, don't forget to cannibalize that subscribe button and follow me on Facebook and Twitter.